mystery, history, cryptid creatures, and paranormal activities. This is the Creeps and Crawls Mystery Hour podcast, and I'm your host, Creeps.
Today's episode is going to be long, and it's actually a three-parter, where we'll go into details about vampires and where they come from. I am hoping with this I can pay homage to certain vampire-y things and things that are often left out with vampire legends. That's going to include Bram Stoker's Dracula, the vampires of Greek times, Victorian vampires, as well as a few short moments covering of Elizabeth Bathory because she's usually intertwined with the vampires. It's gonna be how, vampires evolved. And it's gonna start off with the older vampires, like I was saying, ancient Greek, Victorian vampire. And then the next episode is going to be the 1900s to the early 2000s. And I'm going to say the third one is kind of going to be the early 2000s as well, but it's going to have its own twist. And then the 2010s and 2020s era of the vampire, the kind of evolution that they've gone through. This is one I'm absolutely passionate about. That's why you're going to hear me a little bouncy and happy, and my avatar is going to be moving a lot too, because I'm moving a lot. It's following me. As you see in the background, we've got a vampire. This is actually a drawing I did. It's not very good though, I'm going to be honest. I could have done a lot better with the shading. But, let's go. Let's start talking about it. So, I'm going to say relax, sit back, open your ears. I recommend a soft blanket, a cozy pillow, and maybe a snack while we talk about this murderous, misunderstood bloodsucker. Now, to begin, I cannot start an episode about vampires without describing what a vampire is most commonly, because a vampire can be, skewed. Is a zombie or even a mummy, but they're their own thing, as we well know. And they have their own powers, they're under this undead category, and they can sometimes be labeled as a demigod in some stories. Those, however, are not the true definitive of a vampire, and so for now, what a vampire is an undead creature afflicted with the curse of immortality who has to take either the soul or blood of its victim for its powers. The reason I state this, because in certain stories the vampire is both seen taking the soul and blood, and they seem to need to take some sort of energy to receive their immortal powers, which include mind reading, turning into a bat, immortality, and even sometimes telekinetic powers. And they sometimes can control their victims. And I've seen a few where they can actually control parts of the weather, but I don't think we're going to cover that here. Mostly because, it's a vampire. You're not going to see very many powers associated with them unless it's Twilight or one of those obscure novels from the 2010s or early on. Let's see. So there's different stories from different countries, such as in the Japanese and certain Irish stories, the vampire does suck souls and drain energies from its human counterparts. And sometimes it trade for its own abilities or for the human abilities. Like in Japanese culture and Irish culture, they have this thing called a lamia, which is a vampire. And this is actually seen in the Ancient Mage's Bride. She is able to drain part of his soul to offer him abilities. And it's typically a female, and they're typically offering it to younger males to drain their life force to become part of them. it's very, very, strange. They could trade it for immense wealth or skills, and they could gain, different trades for life. And when they sell their soul, it makes them nothing more than a lifeless husk. Now, another type of vampire is in ancient Greece. It was said that whenever a ginger died, they'd become a soulless wanderer. And they would be stuck on Earth, much like a vampire, drinking the blood of many of their friends in life, which caused much stigma around redheads for many centuries, which I've heard this one my whole entire life because I am a ginger naturally, as well as that I don't have a soul and that I collect souls. So that might have started my little vampire, necessity. And a lot of these, different trends are seen even into the late 1900s, where you'll see the vampire be redheaded in a lot of the paintings and a lot of the little gory books and stuff like that. So it did cause a lot of stigma around redheads for many centuries. And after this, we have Elizabeth Bathory, who I promised I would talk a little bit about, who inspired many great works of fiction. Some being sort of a vampire queen in the 16th to 1800s, but that really isn't, where she was. You can go check out my actual video on her for more facts. And you can uncover her dark secrets, but as people uncover her dark history, especially since this was another sort of Renaissance era for people to create, they used her story to inspire many ideas of what new-aged vampires could be. They used to make stories up of her being this person who would drink the blood of the younger generation, or bathing in the blood of the younger people who she was coming to contact with, and it was mostly women, which actually caused a lot of little erotic lesbian things, let's be honest. You see a lot of that when you look up Elizabeth Bathory, especially when it comes to paintings and little stories. You see her being deep into this lesbianism uprising. She was, however, married to a man and had multiple children. I don't remember how many. It's been a while since I covered her. So, back to her. And this ultimately caused her to be locked away in her castle, but the truth of most of the rumors around her have never actually been proven because, let's be honest, she was rich, she could cover up a lot, and a lot of it spread after she actually died, and after she got locked away when she couldn't talk to people except for her guards. Yeah, so there's that. It's a lot of things about women in power, but we do know she did murder some handmaids, and after her there was Vlad the Impaler, known for making this Dragul family known and well exaggerated over time. He himself was a very exaggerated being. He was known for spiking people's heads onto spikes outside of his castle to send a message, and that's kind of where he gets his vampire-y sort of vibes. It's not actually true for a lot of the things that he is stated to do, so we're not going to mention a lot of the things that you may have heard. I'm only going to mention that of facts that I have actually read up on. There were many folk stories about vampires stalking the fields and arising from graves around the Victorian era as well. People would go around staking corpses because this little disease known as tuberculosis. Their families were dying via a disease where blood was seen everywhere, and they believed dead people would turn into vampires for revenge and steal the blood from their families and enemies, taking their lives slowly in their sleep, and it caused a mania, a panic of sorts, that oftentimes is known as like the vampire era. This is when vampires were really, really like sold, and this is when people started hunting vampires in real life. They would stake the afflicted vampire in their sleep, burn a little bit of their ash, and eat it. People were eating dead bodies, and this is the first time, actually. People were also eating mummies in like the 1910s and 20s, if you didn't know that. And people were actually making money off of this. They were selling vampire hunting kits with silver crosses, stakes, holy water. People would cage coffins to avoid vampires and build mausoleums so vampires couldn't get out. They would even remove the eyes and burn bodies, desecrate family graves, and brutally dismember dead bodies in the wake of this chaos. They would spread body parts across like the countries, and they would burn bodies, they would hang people if they arose from their grave again, even if they weren't actually dead the first time. I mean, this was like havoc. It was crazy, it was dramatic. People were crying and bawling their eyes out because their family members were dying and they didn't know why. They weren't believing it was some sort of disease. They really, really believed it was vampires. And they thought that eating the ashes of the dead member that turned into a vampire was the cure, to which was very far from the truth. Many times people would die and they would assume the vampire was still out there. In fact, that's why cremation kind of came about. And it was kind of this ceremonial type of funeral where the bodies were lit on fire as a belief that it would bring their souls closer to God as the smoke rose. But that's a different story for a different episode, because it's a lot of information. Once we get into it, I will not stop talking. But during this time, there were so many hysterics over vampires because of the disease. It led to wars and family feuds that could not be settled, and it involved church and state so wildly that it was called the Great Vampire Epidemic. And it lasted not just for decades, but for what seemed like 2 centuries before it was actually discovered as a disease, and was no longer called consumption, which was what it was called because they believed vampires or something was consuming their blood in their lives. This is where the idea of the wooden or the silver stake killing vampires come from, as well as things like strong scents such as cloves of garlic and frankincense, as well as holy water being things that they were allergic to, and them not being be able to enter churchyards because they were demonic in some way. And it's also like them being afraid of or resistant to sunlight and running water. And in much later in these stories, because of like different monster types being around, like such as the headless horseman, the running water and covered bridges thing was becoming highly favored to keep monsters away. I don't know what it was. There's like nothing on the internet as to why that would be a weakness. Pretty much everything else is explained though. I mean, maybe it was just they were afraid of running water. And another thing was the once all-powerful vampire. A lot of these different like weaknesses came about, and there were no specific reasons for certain weaknesses coming along. Like I said, the covered bridge in water. And certain people, like, became stigmatized, in fact, to the point where all mature people of age were seen as vampire hunters in like a teen community. A lot of people who were working started hunting vampires at night to make money, and it was a witch hunt of sorts. When vampires were concerned, if you worked at night, dug graves, or even were buried alive, you could be dubbed a vampire, even if you had long nails and weren't well groomed in certain areas. It got so crazy that one day it all just suddenly died down to mere stories. There weren't vampire hunters anymore, and people seemed to become bored of the immortals they once hunted. Probably because of something before they became bored now. I don't want to leave this first part without talking about the most famous stories, though. Because, like, people look forward to hearing about that. 1869, Bram Stoker's Dracula, the classic horror novel that people still talk about today. This, I believe, was the first ever romantic kind of out there version of a vampire, and it's the first instance of Dracula being a thing. And The Hungry Vampire's Desire, Bram wrote a piece inspired by everything I just wrote because it was surrounded by him growing up. And he even did research to the tyrant Vlad the Impaler and used his original name, but instead of Dragul, meaning son of dragon, he uses Dracula. There's this whole thing about names over there, meaning son and father, that plays into the title, but he certainly did his research, and the obsessive Dracula was born and sparked much more sexualized versions of the once scary and kind of ravenous vampire to come to life. And that's kind of the vampire I'll be covering in our last episode on vampires. For now, before I leave you to ponder what I have fondly talked about today, I would like to ask you, what was your favorite type of vampire kind of described in today's episode? And what would you do if you were inflicted or attracted by a great vampire? I mean, because, like, vampires have, like, this hypnosis ability where they can attract a woman or a man to come and do their bidding, kind of known as, like, a fledgling, or, what is that word? They use it in Skyrim. I can't remember, but if you know the word, comment down below. And as always, please stay creepy, my friends.